The soft hum of the crowd echoed in the grand hall as Jessica walked down the aisle. Her steps were graceful, but her heart raced with a storm of emotions. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, but the weight of uncertainty hovered above her like a dark cloud. All eyes were on her, but she didn't notice them. Her focus was fixed on the man waiting for her at the altar, Daniel. He was in a wheelchair, his body still and immobile, but his eyes spoke a different story. "Are you sure about this, Jessica?" her best friend whispered just moments before the ceremony started. "You don't have to do this. He's not the same anymore." Jessica didn't answer. She didn't need to. She had made her choice a long time ago. Her heart ached at the thought of how people pitied Daniel. But they didn't know him. They didn't know the man who had been her protector, her best friend, and her one true love. They didn't know how much strength it took for him to get to this moment, how hard he fought every day just to smile, just to live despite the odds. "You're still my everything," she thought, her heart beating faster as she stood before him, his hands resting on the armrests of the wheelchair. The vows, the tears, the smiles, everyone saw it as a typical wedding. But Jessica knew the truth. This day wasn't about two people getting married. This was about something deeper. Something that would shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew about love, about life, and about second chances. There was a secret, a promise, a hope lingering in the air, one that no one was expecting. But only she knew what it was. And today, on this day, it was about to be revealed. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls pressing in around Jessica as the ceremony progressed. She could barely hear the soft murmur of the guests or the music playing in the background. All she could hear was her own heartbeat, the rush of adrenaline flooding her system. She stole a glance at Daniel, seated in front of her, looking up at her with that quiet, familiar smile that had captured her heart years ago. Daniel's wheelchair wasn't just a seat. It was a symbol of everything he had lost, and everything he had fought so hard to keep. His once active, carefree spirit was buried beneath the weight of the accident that had shattered his body. The physical therapy, the endless treatments, it had taken so much from him. But what had hurt the most was the loss of his independence, the loss of his ability to stand on his own feet. But in his eyes, there was something far deeper than just pain. There was an unwavering strength, a quiet resilience that few could understand and fewer still could truly appreciate, Jessica knew. She had seen it from the very first day she met him. The way he never gave up, even when everyone else said it was hopeless. The way he fought not just for himself, but for their future together. It was as though he carried the weight of both, their dreams on his shoulders despite the odds. Everyone around them saw Daniel's condition as a burden, a reason for sympathy. They saw a man who would never walk again, a man whose life had been stripped of the joy and freedom it once had. They pitied him. They pitied Jessica, too. How could she possibly continue loving him when he could no longer provide the life she deserved? Jessica's parents were the first to voice their concerns. Her mother, always the pragmatic one, sat her down countless times, urging her to move on. "You deserve more, Jessica," she would say. "You're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. You can't waste it on someone who can't even walk." But Jessica had never seen Daniel as broken. To her, he was the same man who had laughed with her, danced with her in the rain, and made her feel like she was the only person in the world that mattered. His wheelchair didn't define him. His past didn't define him. The love they shared, the memories they'd built, those were what truly mattered. It wasn't that she didn't understand the sympathy people had for him. She understood it all too well. She saw the way people's gazes lingered, their eyes filled with pity whenever they saw him in the wheelchair. She heard the hushed voices, the concerned whispers when they thought she wasn't listening. They worried for her. They wondered why she stayed, why she chose to be with someone who could never give her the life they thought she deserved. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know that Daniel had given her a life full of love, even in his silence, They didn't know how much. He had fought for them. How much he had sacrificed, not just for himself, but for her, for their future together. The sympathy they had for him was laced with pity, but Jessica saw beyond that. She saw the kindness in his eyes, the gentle way he cared for her, even when he had every reason to be bitter. She saw the innocence in his heart, the way he always put others first, even when he had nothing left to give. He had always believed in her, in their love, and in their dreams, even when the world told him it was impossible. And Jessica couldn't help but feel that same unwavering belief in him. She saw the man who had loved her unconditionally, the man who had never given up on them, even when the odds were stacked against them. Her heart ached as she thought about how people had always looked at Daniel with sympathy, as though his condition defined who he was. But to her, he was so much more than that. He was a fighter. He was her rock, her partner, the person she had always dreamed of spending her life with. Jessica's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her veil, the weight of the moment sinking in. Her parents' voices echoed in her mind, but she brushed them away. This was her choice. This was her life. She wasn't going to let the opinions of others dictate her happiness. As the ceremony continued, Jessica couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them here, to this very moment. It hadn't been easy. There had been tears, doubts, and challenges along the way. But through it all, their love had only grown stronger. And now, as she stood here, ready to marry the man she loved, Jessica realized that there was no place she would rather be. The world could offer their sympathy, their concerns, but nothing could change the way she felt about Daniel. He was her soulmate. He was the man she wanted to spend the rest of her life with. And nothing, not even the pity of the world, could take that away. As the ceremony progressed, the air in the room grew thick with anticipation, but Jessica's mind began to drift, lost in the quiet storm of thoughts that surged within her. It was as though the wedding had become a turning point, not just for her and Daniel, but for everyone who had gathered in this space. The whispers, the doubts, the pity, they all seemed to blend together into a strange, yet almost surreal, backdrop to what was about to unfold. She caught the eye of her father, sitting in the front row, his face a mix of resignation and concern. It wasn't lost on her how hard this had been for him. She had seen him struggle with his own conflicting emotions. Her father, a man who had always been her protector, had a difficult time accepting Daniel. Not because he didn't like him. No. Daniel had always been kind and respectful, but because he couldn't see past the wheelchair. He couldn't fathom how a young woman like Jessica could find happiness with someone who was so visibly broken, someone who would never be able to take her dancing under the stars or carry her across the threshold of their new home. For years, Jessica's father had tried to shield her from the reality of the world, trying to protect her from anything that could hurt her. But in doing so, he had become blinded to what was right in front of him. Jessica had grown up in a world where love was always presented as a fairy tale, where two people should be able to give each other everything and more. But now, standing here in this room, surrounded by her closest family and friends, Jessica realized how little they understood about the true meaning of love. The realization hit her like a wave crashing against the shore. Love wasn't just about what two people could give each other physically. It wasn't about the grand gestures, the romantic moments, or the shared dreams of the future. Love was about the quiet moments, the sacrifices, the growth, and the understanding that each person brought something to the table, even if it wasn't perfect. And that's when Jessica understood. For the first time, she saw her father's struggle not as a reflection of his distrust in Daniel, but as his inability to grasp the true essence of love. He had lived his life in a world that only accepted the conventional, the expected. He had been raised to believe that a man's worth was defined by his strength, his wealth, and his ability to provide. But that wasn't love, not real love. She could feel the stirrings of compassion within her. an understanding of how much her father had sacrificed for her, how much he had tried to protect her. But she also realized that in his efforts, he had denied her the very thing she needed most, the freedom. As Jessica looked back at Daniel, her heart swelled with pride. In him, she saw everything her father could never understand. Daniel had given up so much of his life, his freedom, his independence, but he had never once let that define him. He had never used his wheelchair as an excuse, never let it diminish the depth of his love. And in this moment, she knew that it was Daniel's strength, his ability to rise above his circumstances, that made him worthy of her love, not his physical abilities or the limitations others had placed on him. Jessica's realization was profound. She wasn't just marrying a man who had overcome adversity. She was marrying a man who had taught her what it meant to truly love, to give without expectations, and to rise above the world's judgments. In the quiet strength of his heart, she had found the courage to break free from the expectations of her family and society. She had learned that true love wasn't about perfection. It was about understanding, compassion, and the willingness to stand by each other, no matter what. The ceremony was almost over now, and as Jessica stood there, the weight of the moment pressed heavily upon her. Her thoughts turned back to her father and the look of confusion and hurt on his face. He had never truly understood why she had chosen Daniel, and yet, now, in this moment, Jessica realized that it wasn't her father's approval she needed to seek. It was her own. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about living her truth, her love, and her choices. Jessica could feel the growth within her heart, her mind, her understanding of what it meant to be truly free. In choosing Daniel, she wasn't just accepting him for who he was. She was accepting herself, her own right to love without fear of judgment. And it wasn't just Jessica who was undergoing a transformation. Daniel, too, had been on a journey of self-discovery. For years, he had hidden behind the belief that he was less than worthy, that his wheelchair had made him unlovable, undeserving of love and affection. But as he looked at Jessica, as she gazed at him with eyes full of unwavering love, he felt something shift inside him. The weight of the world no longer seemed so heavy. The doubt, the shame, the guilt, they all began to fade as he realized that Jessica's love was not conditional. She didn't love him because of what he could give, or because he could fulfill some preconceived notion of what a partner should be. She loved him because of who he was, because of the person he had become through his struggle. In that moment, as they stood together in front of their families, the love between them was pure, untainted by expectations or limitations. Daniel realized that he didn't need to prove anything to anyone, least of all himself. He had already proved his worth through his actions, through his love, and through his unwavering belief in Jessica. And Jessica, for the first time in her life, understood that love wasn't something that could be controlled or measured. It was something that grew organically, deep within the heart, and transcended every obstacle. The room fell into an unexpected silence. It was almost as if the world had held its breath, waiting for the next moment to unfold. Jessica's gaze remained fixed on Daniel, her heart pounding in her chest. His eyes, filled with uncertainty and vulnerability, met hers, and she could see the storm of emotions raging within him. The doubts, the fears, the lifetime of rejection he had faced. All of it was written in the subtle tension of his posture, the tightness in his jaw. And yet, despite all that, there was a quiet strength that radiated from him. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. His words were not born from a place of doubt about her love for him, but rather an uncertainty about his own worth. After all, how could a man who was bound to a wheelchair be worthy of the beautiful, vibrant woman standing before him? How could he live up to the dreams of a life that Jessica had once imagined, a life filled with adventure, spontaneity, and freedom? Jessica's heart broke at his words. She had known this moment would come, knew that despite the love they shared, the questions would rise within him. She had seen the way the world looked at him, how they viewed him with pity, with judgment, as though his condition defined him. But Daniel was not defined by his wheelchair. He was defined by his heart, his soul, and his unwavering love for her. Taking a deep breath, Jessica stepped closer, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out to gently touch his face. "Yes," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I am sure. I've always been sure. From the moment I met you, from the first time we spoke, I knew. I knew you were the one." Daniel's eyes searched hers, as though trying to understand if she truly meant it. His fingers brushed against her hand, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. The weight of his doubts hung heavy in the air, but Jessica could feel the pulse of something stronger, something deeper than fear, something pure and undeniable. "You see," she continued, her voice growing more confident with each word, "love isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing each other, every single day, no matter what. It's about standing by each other through the hardest of times, through the moments when the world tells us we can't. I don't need you to be anything other than who you are. And who you are is everything to me." Her words, simple yet profound, cut through the heavy fog of doubt that had clouded his mind. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as the meaning of her words sank in. For the first time, he allowed himself to truly feel worthy of her love. Not because of what he could do, but because of who he was at his core. Tears welled up in his eyes, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. His heart ached with the weight of the journey they had traveled together, the struggles they had faced, the barriers they had broken. He had always thought that love was something he could never have, something that would always be just out of his reach. But Jessica had proven him wrong. She had given him the greatest gift, a love that wasn't bound by limitations, a love that saw him for who he truly was. "Jessica," he whispered, his voice breaking, "I don't know if I deserve you." Jessica smiled softly, her thumb brushing away the tear that had escaped his eye. "You do. You always have." She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his. In that moment, nothing else mattered. The world outside, the opinions of others, the doubts, they all faded into the background. It was just them. In this small, intimate moment, they were the only two people in the world. Their love, raw and unfiltered, was the only thing that held any meaning. The room remained silent, but it was no longer heavy with the weight of judgment. Instead, it was filled with the quiet understanding that the most beautiful love stories were not the ones that were perfect or without hardship. They were the ones that overcame obstacles, that rose above adversity, and that stood firm in the face of fear and uncertainty. "Thank you," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for believing in me, for seeing me the way I've always wanted to be seen." Jessica's heart swelled with love, her chest tight with the depth of the moment. "I don't just believe in you, Daniel," she said, her voice full of conviction. "I believe in us, and I always will." At that moment, the world seemed to shift. The doubts, the insecurities, the judgment, they all seemed irrelevant in the face of this truth. Jessica realized that this wasn't just about her and Daniel. It was about everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough, everyone who had ever been defined by their limitations, everyone who had ever been told they couldn't achieve their dreams. It was about proving that love, real love, wasn't about perfection. It was about accepting each other's flaws, strengths, and weaknesses. It was about building a life together, not on the foundation of what they could do for each other, but on what they could give each other emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. They stood there, locked in their embrace. Jessica knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The world could say what it wanted, but they had each other, and that was all they needed. The emotional weight of the moment lifted from Daniel's shoulders, and for the first time in years he felt free. Free to love without fear. free to be himself without apology. And as he looked at Jessica, the woman who had fought for him, who had seen him for who he truly was, he knew that nothing could ever tear them apart. As the days passed, Jessica's life began to shift in ways she hadn't anticipated. The weight of caring for Daniel, though filled with love, was not without its challenges. There were moments when the exhaustion crept in, when the world outside seemed to move at a pace she could no longer keep up with. She had always been independent, always dreamed of a life full of adventure and excitement. Yet now, it seemed like the adventure had shifted into something quieter, something that demanded a different kind of strength. There were times when Daniel would sleep late, his body finally able to rest after a long day of physical therapy and healing, and Jessica would quietly slip out of the room. Her heart would ache as she watched him sleep, his face peaceful and relaxed. But the truth of their reality was undeniable. He was no longer the man he had been before the accident, and neither was she. Both had changed, and both were learning how to navigate this new life together. Every moment of their relationship had been built on the understanding that love was not easy. But love didn't come with an instruction manual. There were no clear guidelines for what it meant to be a caregiver, to love someone through their most vulnerable moments, to carry the weight of their insecurities and dreams all at once. Sometimes it felt like no one could see the quiet sacrifices she was making. People didn't know about the nights when she stayed awake, making sure Daniel was comfortable, making sure he felt loved despite his own doubts. They didn't know about the times she had to set aside her own dreams and aspirations, the small but consistent moments where she gave up a piece of herself to ensure Daniel had everything he needed. It wasn't that Daniel asked for it. He never demanded anything from her. He never wanted her to give up her dreams or to feel like she had to put everything on hold for him. But love wasn't about asking for it. It was about doing what was necessary, even when it meant silently sacrificing parts of yourself. One night, as Jessica was cleaning the kitchen, she glanced at the clock and realized that it was well past midnight. She had been running around all day, between work, therapy sessions for Daniel, and household chores. There had been no time for herself, no time to just breathe. The overwhelming weight of the responsibility pressed heavily on her chest. She sat down on the couch for a brief moment of respite. Daniel rolled in, his wheelchair gliding silently across the floor. She hadn't heard him coming, but she knew that he had noticed her silent fatigue. He stopped in front of her, his eyes full of concern. "Jess," he said quietly, his voice gentle but filled with worry. "You've been running yourself ragged. Why don't you take a break?" Jessica smiled weakly, her eyes flickering with gratitude, but also with the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. She had grown so used to being the strong one, the one who always had everything under control. But in that moment, as she looked at Daniel's concerned eyes, she realized that he had seen her sacrifices, even if she had never spoken of them. "I'm fine," she said softly, though her voice trembled slightly. "Just a little tired, that's all." But Daniel wasn't fooled. He reached out, his hand gently resting on hers. "You don't have to be perfect, Jess. You don't have to carry everything by yourself. I'm here too. Let me help you." A rush of emotions surged through Jessica. She didn't speak for a moment, her heart swelling with both love and a deep sense of relief. She had always carried her burdens alone, had always thought that taking care of Daniel meant hiding her own struggles. But in that moment, Daniel had offered her a lifeline. "I know you're doing everything you can," Daniel continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But I don't want you to lose yourself in the process. We're in this together. Let me help you carry some of the weight." Tears welled in Jessica's eyes. She had been so focused on taking care of Daniel that she had forgotten to take care of herself. She had been quietly sacrificing, not just her time and energy, but her sense of self as well. But in that moment, with Daniel's gentle words, she realized that true love wasn't about being perfect. It was about supporting each other through every high and low, through every sacrifice and every quiet struggle. She squeezed his hand, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. Thank you for seeing me. For the first time in a long while, Jessica allowed herself to feel the relief of knowing that she didn't have to carry the weight alone. And as Daniel helped her to her feet and they walked together to the living room, she realized that the silent sacrifices were worth it. Not because they were unnoticed, but because they had built a love so deep, so unwavering, that it allowed both of them to find peace in the midst of their struggles. Jessica's commitment to Daniel had always been unwavering, but as the days wore on, it was becoming more and more apparent that the weight of responsibility was starting to take its toll. The protective instinct she had toward him had grown stronger with every passing day, almost as if it was second nature now. She found herself standing by him in ways she had never imagined, fighting for him, for their love, and for their future, in ways she could hardly put into words. One morning, when Daniel was scheduled for a particularly difficult therapy session, Jessica could sense his growing unease. He had always been a proud man, even before the accident, and now, more than ever, he was reluctant to admit just how much he struggled. He didn't want to show any weakness, but Jessica could see it in the way his eyes clouded over with uncertainty, in the way his hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair as if they were his only source of stability. She stepped forward, placing her hand gently on his shoulder, the warmth of her touch grounding him. "You're stronger than this, Daniel," she said, her voice full of quiet conviction. "I know it's hard, but you've come so far. We can do this together." He didn't look at her immediately, as if he were still wrestling with his pride. But Jessica knew he heard her. She could feel it in the way he exhaled deeply, the tension in his shoulders easing, if only slightly. "You don't have to do this alone," she added softly. "You've never been alone in this, and you won't be now. I'm with you, every step of the way." There was a brief pause as Daniel looked at her, his gaze heavy with gratitude and guilt. "I don't want to hold you back, Jess," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "I want to be the man you deserve." Jessica's heart clenched at his words. She could see how much he hated being dependent on others, how deeply it wounded him, to feel like he couldn't provide for her, couldn't give her the life he had once dreamed of. But what Daniel didn't realize was that Jessica didn't need him to be perfect. She didn't need him to be the man he used to be. She needed him to be real, to be the man who fought with everything he had to stand tall, even if it was only with her by his side. "You are the man I deserve," she replied, her voice firm, unwavering. "You've always been that man, Daniel. And I don't need anything more than the man who's sitting right here in front of me." Her words hung in the air between them, the weight of their truth sinking deep into Daniel's heart. For the first time, he allowed himself to lean into her, to accept the strength she offered him, to let go of the guilt that had been weighing him down for so long. As they prepared to head to the therapy session, Jessica's protective instinct kicked into overdrive. She could feel Daniel's hesitation, but she could also feel the fire of determination in her own heart. She was going to make sure he knew that he wasn't alone in this, no matter how much he tried to shut the world out, no matter how hard he tried to push her away. She would be there, fighting for him, for them. When they arrived at the therapy center, the physical and emotional challenges awaiting Daniel were immense. The therapists had prepared an intense regimen for him, designed to push him beyond his comfort zone and to test his limits. But as the exercises began, Jessica stood by, watching intently, her eyes never leaving Daniel's face. She could see the strain in his eyes, could hear the quiet gasps as he struggled to keep up with the pace of the session. And yet, she stayed calm. She remained grounded. She knew that this was part of the process, part of the healing, the recovery. Her presence, her strength was what he needed now more than ever. With every push, every step, every movement that caused him to falter, Jessica's gaze never wavered. She knew the moment Daniel saw her watching, he would push harder. He would try his best to keep up, not just for himself, but for her. She had become his anchor in a sea of uncertainty, his guiding force in a world that had suddenly become overwhelming. The therapists noticed the change in Daniel too. His movements became more fluid, his expressions more focused. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore, he was putting his whole heart into every step, every stretch, every effort. And Jessica knew this was the result of her determination. Her quiet, unyielding belief in him had ignited something deep within him, something that had been buried under layers of self-doubt and fear. When the session ended, Daniel was exhausted, but there was something new in his eyes. It wasn't just the familiar spark of pride he'd once carried. It was the fire of someone who had been reminded of his strength, who had been reminded that no matter what, he had someone who would stand by him, someone who would never give up on him. Jessica helped him back into his wheelchair, her hands gentle as she adjusted the straps. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw a silent understanding pass between them. She had been his protector, his strength in the storm, and now it was his turn to fight back. It wasn't just about therapy. I couldn't do this without you, Daniel whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. You'll never have to, Jessica replied softly, her voice steady, unwavering. I'm not going anywhere. In that moment, it wasn't just about the physical therapy or the progress Daniel had made. It was about the bond they had forged, a bond built on determination, on shared sacrifices, and on an unshakable promise to never give up, no matter what. And as they left the therapy center that day, Jessica's heart swelled with pride, not just for the strength Daniel had shown, but for the strength they had shown as a team. Together, they could face anything. The moment the accident occurred, Daniel's life took a nosedive into an abyss of shame, guilt, and regret. It wasn't just the injury that broke him, it was everything that followed. The way his life had been reshaped, not just physically, but emotionally. It was the way he had been forced to confront the fragile nature of life, the harshness of fate, and the painful reality that things would never be the same again. When Daniel was first released from the hospital, he could hardly bear to look at himself in the mirror. He saw a man broken, a man who once stood tall and proud, someone who could conquer any challenge that life threw his way. But now his wheelchair was a constant reminder of his limitations, of the dream that had been shattered beyond repair. His hands, once so strong and capable, now trembled with the weight of his new reality. It wasn't just the physical change that hurt him the most, it was his inability to reconcile the man he once was with, the man he had become. And worst of all, it was the guilt that gnawed at him, the constant feeling that he had failed those who loved him. He had failed Jessica. He remembered the promise he had made to her before the accident, the promise that he would always take care of her, that he would always be strong for her. Now it seemed like a cruel joke. How could he take care of her when he could barely take care of himself? How could he protect her when his body betrayed him at every turn? The days after the accident were the darkest of his life. He could barely look Jessica in the eye, and every time she offered him a comforting smile, it felt like a knife twisting in his chest. She deserved so much more than this, more than the man who now needed help for even the simplest tasks. In his regret, Daniel withdrew. He pushed Jessica away, not because he didn't love her, but because he felt unworthy of her love. He had once been the man she could rely on, the one who made her laugh and lifted her spirits when she was down. But now, he was just a burden. He couldn't bear to see the pity in her eyes, the way her face softened in sadness when she helped him. It broke him every single time. But despite his attempts to distance himself, Jessica never gave up. She never stopped fighting for him, never stopped believing in the man he had been and the man he could still become. She refused to let him drown in his own regret. She fought for him even when he couldn't fight for himself. One evening, after weeks of avoiding any real conversation, Daniel found himself alone in the living room staring out the window. It was a quiet, still night, and the world outside seemed to carry on, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. His life was no longer his own. It was dictated by his condition, by the daily struggles that he now faced. Jessica entered the room quietly, her footsteps soft against the hardwood floor. She sat down beside him, her presence as familiar as the warmth of the sun on his face. "You've been so quiet lately," she said softly, her voice filled with gentle concern. "What's going on, Daniel?" He turned to her, his eyes filled with the weight of his emotions, but he said nothing. What could he say? How could he explain the emptiness inside him, the regret that consumed him? How could he tell her that he hated himself for what he had become? "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry I can't be the man I was. The man you deserve." Jessica didn't say anything at first. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand gently on his. The simple act of touch was enough to make Daniel's breath catch in his throat. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice steady and sure. "You are the man I deserve. You always have been." He shook his head, tears starting to well up in his eyes. "No, Jessica. I'm not the man I was. I'm not even close. I'm weak, I'm broken, and I can't even take care of myself, let alone you. I don't know how you can still look at me and—" She cut him off, her voice firm but filled with compassion. "I don't look at you that way, Daniel. I don't see you as weak or broken. I see you as strong, because you've been fighting every single day. Not just for yourself, but for us. I know it's hard. I know it's difficult, but you're still the same man I fell in love with. You're still the man I believe in." Daniel felt the tears slip down his cheeks now, his emotions pouring out of him, emotions that had been locked away for far too long. He realized in that moment that the guilt, the regret, the self-loathing was only keeping him from seeing the truth. He had been so focused on what he had lost, so consumed by what he could no longer do, that he had failed to see what he still had. He had love. He had Jessica. He had people who cared for him, who believed in him. And he had the chance to redeem himself, not through his physical strength, but through his heart, his determination, and his will to be the best man he could be for her. For them. I don't know if I can do it," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. "But I want to try. I want to try for you. I want to try for us." Jessica smiled softly, the kind of smile that made Daniel's heart swell with emotion. "That's all I need, Daniel. Just try, and I'll be here every step of the way. We'll do this together." Daniel realized that redemption wasn't about regaining what he had lost. It was about letting go of his regret and embracing the man he was now, the man he could still become with Jessica by his side. He didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be present. He needed to fight, not for a past version of himself, but for the man he was becoming. As the days passed, the weight of Daniel's situation began to settle more heavily on him. It wasn't just the physical limitations that consumed his thoughts, but the constant fear that he would never be enough for Jessica, or that his disability would continue to overshadow their relationship. There were times when he would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, gripped by the thought that he would never be able to stand and walk again, never be able to hold Jessica the way he had before, or be the man she deserved. But amidst his despair, a deep, gnawing feeling began to stir inside him, like a quiet voice urging him to keep going, to fight. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, a flickering flame of determination buried beneath the rubble of his doubts and fears. One morning, Daniel was sitting by the window, watching the world go by. The same view he had seen countless times before, but today it looked different. There was a strange stillness in the air, as if the world was holding its breath. His mind raced with thoughts of how he could change things, how he could finally stand up again, how he could be the man Jessica needed, the man he knew he still could be. Jessica entered the room quietly, her presence like a soft wind against his skin. She knew he had been struggling, but she never pushed him to talk before he was ready. She simply sat beside him, placing a gentle hand on his arm, giving him the quiet strength he needed to keep going. "Daniel, you've been quieter than usual today. What's going on?" she asked softly, her voice filled with care. He hesitated, the words caught in his throat. He wanted to say something hopeful, something inspiring, but all that came to mind was the truth, that he was afraid, terrified that he might never walk again, that his life might be reduced to this wheelchair forever. I don't know. Anymore, Jessica," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so tired. I feel like I'm stuck in this chair, in this life, and I can't get out. It's like I'm trapped in a nightmare, one I can't escape from." Jessica listened, quietly, her heart aching for him, but she knew the truth. She knew that deep down, Daniel still had the strength to overcome this. He just needed to believe it. "Daniel," she said, her voice strong and unwavering, "I know it's hard, but you've never been the type of person to back down from a challenge. You've always fought for what you believed in, no matter how difficult it was. This isn't any different." He turned to look at her, confusion clouding his expression. "But I can't even walk anymore, Jessica." She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before speaking again. "Daniel, you don't have to be the man you were. You just need to be the man you are now. And the man I see now is someone who has been through hell and back, but still has the heart to fight. You're stronger than you think. You have a fire inside you, and no wheelchair can take that away." Her words struck something deep inside him, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. "She's right," he thought. "I may not be able to walk yet, but I still have the strength to fight. I still have my heart, my will to live, and my love for her." The days that followed were filled with small steps of progress, each one more challenging than the last. There were moments when Daniel felt like giving up, when his body screamed in protest, and his mind whispered that it would be easier to just accept this new reality. But every time he felt like quitting, he remembered Jessica's words. "You have a fire inside you." One morning, Daniel found himself sitting at the edge of his bed, staring at his wheelchair. The room was quiet. The only sound was the gentle hum of the outside world. For a moment, he considered not trying, considered letting his body remain in the chair, letting the fear of failure win. But then, something inside him shifted. His fingers curled into fists, and his breathing steadied. "No," he thought. "I can do this. I can walk again. I just need to take it one step at a time." With slow, deliberate movements, Daniel placed his hands on the armrests of the wheelchair and began to push himself upright. His legs trembled, his muscles screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. The room seemed to close in around him, but he kept pushing through. Every inch of progress felt like an eternity, but with each moment he could feel the weight of his fears starting to lift. "Come on, Daniel. You've got this," he whispered to himself. Jessica stood at the doorway, watching him with a mixture of awe and admiration. She had never doubted him, but seeing him push past his limits, seeing him fight for something more, stirred something deep inside her. She stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew you could do it." Daniel looked up at her, his face flushed with the effort, but a triumphant smile spread across his face. "I'm not done yet," he said, his voice filled with newfound determination. "But I'm getting there." For the first time in what felt like forever, Daniel felt like he was truly fighting for his future again. The road ahead was still long, and there would be setbacks and challenges, but he had found the strength to move forward. And that, in itself, was the greatest victory. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Daniel's life began to slowly shift. He was still not walking, but the glimmer of hope he had discovered in himself that day by the window had not faded. It had only grown, nurtured by the love and support of Jessica, and his own unyielding determination. Every day he worked hard. He pushed through the pain, through the frustration, and through the overwhelming desire to just give up. But with each small victory, each step, no matter how shaky, he began to rebuild not only his body, but his confidence as well. It wasn't just the physical progress that changed him. It was the emotional and mental awakening he had experienced along the way. He learned to believe in himself again, and in doing so, he realized that there was no limit to what he could achieve. But the road was still far from easy. There were still days when his body seemed to betray him, when his legs trembled beneath him, threatening to collapse under the weight of his dreams. And there were nights when his doubts crept back in, whispering that maybe he wasn't meant for this. Maybe he was destined to live a life confined to a wheelchair. But there was also Jessica. She was there in every moment, supporting him without hesitation, holding him when the world seemed to turn dark. She was his light. And though she had her own fears, she never once let them show. She believed in him more than he believed in himself. And that unwavering belief gave him the strength to keep fighting. One afternoon, Daniel found himself standing in front of the mirror. He had spent the last few weeks pushing himself harder than ever before, determined to prove to himself that he could overcome this. But today, something felt different. There was a fire in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. As he looked at himself, standing tall, leaning slightly on his crutches, he realized that the man staring back at him wasn't just the man who had once sat helpless in a wheelchair. He was a man who had fought for his life and won, one step at a time, one struggle at a time. A smile slowly spread across his face. "I'm doing it," he whispered to himself. "I'm really doing it." Just as he turned to walk out of the room, Jessica entered, her eyes lighting up as she saw him. The smile that spread across her face matched his. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice filled with awe and admiration. "You're walking." "I am," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He paused, gathering himself before taking a few more steps toward her. He reached out and took her hand, his heart swelling with gratitude and love. And in that moment, everything became clear to him. The pain, the struggle, the sleepless nights, all of it had been part of his journey. A journey that had led him here, to this very moment, where he was no longer defined by his limitations, but by the strength he had found within himself. And he was no longer just a man in a wheelchair. He was a man who had fought, who had never given up, and who had finally learned the most important lesson of all. That true strength isn't about how fast you can run or how far you can walk. True strength is about never giving up, no matter what life throws your way. Jessica stepped closer, her eyes glistening with tears of joy. "I'm so proud of you, Daniel. You did it." "I couldn't have done it without you," he said, his voice full of emotion. "You gave me the strength to believe in myself when I didn't think I could anymore. You never gave up on me." Jessica smiled, her eyes softening. "I never will." Daniel looked down at their joined hands, his heart overflowing with gratitude. "Thank you for not giving up on us. I'm not the man I was before, but I'm stronger now because of you." The weight of the past, the fears, and the doubts all seemed to lift in that moment. Daniel realized that the true meaning of the journey wasn't just the physical act of walking again, it was the emotional and mental transformation that had taken place inside him. He was no longer the man who was afraid of his own weakness. He was the man who had faced his greatest fear and come out on the other side stronger, more determined, and more alive than ever before. And with Jessica by his side, he knew that the future was full of endless possibilities. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Daniel stood tall, his crutches supporting him, but no longer defining him. The journey had been long, and it had been difficult, but the clarity that came from the struggle was undeniable. He was no longer bound by the wheelchair that had once confined him. He was free, in every sense of the word, and as he turned to Jessica, her hand still in his. He knew that together they could face anything. The future was wide open, and it was filled with hope.